I believe in the synergy that takes place when we're allowed to have conversations amongst ourselves. So let me begin by sharing what I was thinking earlier this morning. Earlier this morning, as I was thinking about this week being the week where we celebrate the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I clearly thought to myself, it troubles me when people say Martin Luther King Jr. died. Martin Luther King Jr. did not die. And no, I'm not trying to say that he like Tupac, or Elvis Presley, that he still lives. No. He didn't die. He was assassinated. Yeah. And I think we ought to remember that. That's very important. His life was ended as he was engaged in civil disobedience. And for the purpose, he was truly involved. He truly wanted civil discourse. So he embodied what we're trying to discuss here tonight. And today, in 2013, we are still faced with many of the same challenges for which Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. We are living in a very polarized society. And I'm not simply speaking about the United States of America or the United Methodist Church, but I'm saying we live in a polarized world where people are incapable very often of engaging in civil discourse. More often than not, what we attempt to do is you see people walk into a room with their minds already made up. And to me, that lacks integrity. Civil discourse is when you enter an environment honest with the integrity that says, I reserve the right to have my opinion changed because I have been with you. Context. The United Methodist Church has not engaged its lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer folk honestly. And I would also say it has not engaged its heterosexual folk honestly, because it attempts to silence the voices of its membership through its polity that says homosexual persons or homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And also through another paragraph that allows pastors to deny membership from persons who want to become a member of the body of Christ in our local church. Now, how does the church do that? Not only through its polity, but also when we come together at general conference. We've articulated what is called holy conferencing, a term that I have come to despise. Because there's very little about holy conferencing. What holy conferencing has become is an attempt to silence the voices of persons that will not commit to living their lives as the church or as the church's polity demands they live. And Bishop Talbert, you said something early on when you were talking about racism, being in the environment of racism. You said, I knew within my soul that I could not survive that environment, so I sought to escape. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and heterosexual folk are recognizing that we cannot survive within an environment that seeks to silence us, that refuses to allow honest civil discourse. And when you attempt to silence the voice of a people, they have a moral responsibility to disobey law. And you see this in the civil rights movement. In 2008, I'm trying to get here. In 2008, I was sitting in my office at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. They were live streaming the General Conference of the United Methodist Church. Somewhere in there, Holy Conferencing, whatever, had broken down. And some very vile attacks began to take place on the floor of the United Methodist Church's General Conference. Bishop Talbert, I heard his voice. I heard the voice of this man say, "Church, let's not do this." And this voice began to recount to the church the history of racism within what we now call the United Methodist Church. And this voice began to weave together the history of oppression that's written in our book of discipline, which we refuse to look at to this day and say, look, we're going down the same path. And the voice was Bishop Talbert. And I sat in my office and I began to cry because he was trying to engage the church in civil discourse in a way that he was trying to encourage people to be willing to hear each other respectfully, to be changed by each other's voices, and to come to some kind of peaceful resolution that does not attempt to squash people from being their authentic self. And when I heard Bishop Talbot, I began to cry in my office, and I began the process the next week of coming out to the president of my seminary. I've been out with my children for years, but I began to take the step to come out across the church and within the seminary. I needed to do that because I knew I couldn't survive in the manner in which I was living, and I just need to be my most authentic self. Another thing I want to say before I sit down, not only must our church recommit itself and begin to look at civil discourse differently, the church must also recognize that the civil disobedience or the biblical obedience that Bishop Talbert is asking and encouraging us to commit ourselves to did not come to the church tabula rasa. Just as civil disobedience at the time of King did not occur tabula rasa, so also this cry for civil obedience. It comes after years and after many sessions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folk trying to get the church to do what God has called it to do and to be what God has called it to be. And there comes a moment in the life of any movement where the leaders and the members of that movement say enough is enough. Like Fannie Lou Hamer, they will say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer folk are sick and tired of the church trying to squash out their voice. And they're sick and tired of the church trying to legislate them to be what they know God did not call them to be. We simply want to exist in the church and be the people of sacred worth that the church says that we are. And so in 2012, when Bishop Talbert says to us, look, we will be biblically obedient, all of this is a process. This has been a process. And now it's reached the tip of the iceberg. And we are fighting now the oppressive power of the church. We need to do that. And I thank you for being here so we can continue to engage that. Thank you, Bishop.
I'd first like to invite, first gratitude both to Will and to Pamela for your responses. And I would first like to invite the three of you. Is there a comment that you want to say to each other before we open it to the body?
I would just like to begin by saying my word of appreciation to both of you for your responses, and Will in particular. You called me out on the use of the word norm. Thank you. That's very helpful. And you captured what I intended by using that expression, but simply by using that word, I think it took away and what I was trying to say. So I will not use that word.
There's nothing normal about you.
Well, I want to thank Will and Bishop Talbert for sharing with us their life experience. I think sometimes we take for granted that it's very easy for people to share or to peel back the layers to show who they are beyond what we see day to day. It's not an easy process. And so to the extent that they've done that, I really appreciate that. I'm intrigued, Bishop Talbert, by your helping us to understand the distinction between racism and prejudice. And I think that's very important, and I hope we all got that today. And I think that, you know, as I made a note, prejudice plus power equals all of these isms.
Right.
I'm old enough to have gone through the point where I've had men point their fingers in my face and tell me, as a 19-year-old woman called to preach, that God did not call any woman to preach, and that I ought to sit down and shut up, otherwise I was going to hell. So I appreciate the distinction that you placed there.
I have just one thing to say. I think I can just go like this, right? Thank you. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you doesn't begin. And just to be at this table is awesome. But thank you all. I feel a little strange about something I said, and something I say a lot, and something I believe, encouraging people to ministry in the United Methodist Church with LGBT people, especially in light of what the bishop shared about how, and also what the dean shared about risking lives. Because so often I say to people, and I do think it's true and helpful at times, to say, get over it, you know, about performing this wedding or about whatever, like, you can do this. This is not that big a deal. So I want to acknowledge the different realities of different ways that we have witnessed and been in ministry, and how there are plenty of times stuff that, you know, aren't even going to be shared in this room about risks that I can't even imagine. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you to all three of you for that dialogue. We obviously do not have a lot of time for conversation. I've been told that we must be finished here by 20:00. Now, I can't see that clock.
You got 15 minutes, Bishop.
But I would invite you, if you have a question to give to the panel, if you would stand up, and I will try to listen and repeat the question so that everybody can hear it, and it be gathered, recorded also. So what questions, and if you want to address the question to a particular panelist, please feel free to name them. Gary?
The issue of risk and privilege, you've mentioned risk, and especially as MLK Day and all of that, we sort of recall the risk, because MLK, when he was assassinated, was not a popular figure, let's be honest. And he's sort of been neutralized and purified and everything else. But the point, I guess my point is, a lot of us, and I'm from point of privilege, I even get paid by the church for not doing anything anymore. A lot of us are in a situation where, you know, to take seriously that risk. And that is that I'm not going to be pulled out of the church. I'm not going to be denied ordination. I'm not going to be any of that kind of thing. And yet there's still a role. It occurs to me that in many cases, in many cases, we try to get into comfort without facing that call to risk.
I think that life itself is a risk. And the moment that we decide that, what did Martin Luther King say, by quoting Burke, as good people in this society, we remain silent. And let me just say, our country's going to hell right now because we got congressional leaders who are not acting for the common good. Yet we got good people in our churches who are not speaking out. They're not saying anything. They're allowing it to happen. And if we don't take some risk, what we're doing is saying the status quo is acceptable. That's my response.
And I want to say that Martin Luther King was exceptionally popular. He was popular enough for COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence movement to be the FBI to be targeting him. He was not accepted in many spheres, but in the African American context, he was very popular and quite beloved, not by all, but very popular and quite beloved. And I make that point to say this. Within every group, there is a subgroup. And so everyone does not agree within groups. Within the LGBTQ community, we have our own challenges. And we have yet to work them out. Challenges of racism, sexism, classism, discussions about being bisexual and transgender. We need to work out our ish. And we haven't done that fully yet. So there are these challenges.
I'm going to go back here. You, sir?
I'm curious how the panel would respond to the distinction between power held by people and the power of an idea. I think you did a really wonderful job of talking about sexist power versus racist power versus heterosexist power, of certain people wanting to hold on to the power that they have around those things. As an openly identified trans person who is also clergy, I am often faced with people of any particular sex, of any particular sexual orientation, or of any particular race, really holding up the gender binary as the thing that is the thing. Right? And anything else, any other recognition of any other gender identity or gender nonconformity is the thing that I am fighting against. I'm working to get through an idea that is so deeply held that the idea in and of itself has the most power, not any particular demographic of people. So I'm trying to figure out how to work through that kind of power. So if any or all of you could speak to that, I would appreciate it.
Are you suggesting that that's even another level?
It feels like a different level.
That's what I was hearing you ask.
It feels like a different level. Changing the hearts and minds of people can happen, and I've witnessed it happen, and I go into churches and work with folks around those sorts of things. But those ideas that are so deeply held, feels like it comes from a different place and needs to be approached differently. I'm not sure if that's right, but that's how it feels.
I'll say something. Thanks for that question, the topic. It sounds very exciting, your ministry, and it seems that asking those big questions and inviting people to move into that new space is the heart and soul of Christian ministry and following Christ. So yes, I'm thrilled. And it doesn't. It never ends where the lines never fall where we think they're going to. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I said I didn't say very much about power, but throughout my whole life, I understand that each individual has in his or herself power given by God, power that's intended to be used. The question is, how are we going to use it? Are we going to use it for good or for evil? And what I'm trying to do is to call people forth to use the power that is within them, God given, for the common good of all humanity, rather than joining the forces of evil that are excluding some and including others.
But I think I also hear you say, I think I'm hearing you asking us not necessarily to dispel with normativity, but I think I'm hearing you challenge us to begin to think of ways that we can dispel the kind of normativity that oppresses, which is what Bishop Talbert was talking about. And I think that in order to do that, we should embrace a certain type of grace in our conversation that allows persons seated around the table to make errors to have errors in language. You saw a perfect example of that. Such that persons who are our allies are not put on the back burner just because they don't have the language to engage us.
Right.
But that we embody some sort of grace to say, okay, I really get where you're trying to go. Let me help you articulate that in a better way. Let me help you articulate that for transgender persons, for queer persons. Is that?
That's right.
One more question. I see one in the front row.
I was at a general conference. I'm a United Methodist pastor, clergy, who hanging on by my fingernails. And I think I want to go back to general conference in 3.5 years from now. And I guess I'd like to hear some wisdom of how to be present. Not just by myself, but with some of the people that we talked about.
I'm not sure if you heard that in the back. The question is, Reverend Todd had been at General Conference as a volunteer, just hanging on, wondering how to think about returning. What word might the panels provide in giving him some hope and some direction?
Let me say something. You have more power and authority than you think. You talked about the system that we are in. I'm saying it's time for us to stop spending all of our time and energy trying to vote and maneuver that. Let's focus on where it makes a difference. There are clergy and lay folk in the communities where you live want to hear your voice. They don't want you to be silent anymore. They want to hear what you got to say about the issues that they are facing, and particularly the issue of an inclusion of GLBT people. And if you want to make a difference over the next 3 years, you ought to be finding as many clergy, and particularly the younger clergy, that you can, and speak to them as colleagues in ministry and urge them to come to grips with who they are and to take responsibility for their lives and to witness in the name of Jesus Christ. And take this issue head on and give them some courage to stand up and be over against this immoral laws and actions that are causing us to have such a pall of fear over us.
Yes.
The question people ask me is, aren't you overwhelmed by the responses that you're getting because of your stance? The answer is no. conversations are going on over up here in the air, but none of them are talking to me. You know? and the same will be true for you. You know, you just got to say to folk, do the right thing. Do what is right. Do what is just. And let the chips fall where they may. And you can do that. You know, and clergy, particularly younger clergy and layfolk, are waiting to hear voices like yours. And then you would go back to General Conference and see what happens. But as was said earlier, I'm not too hopeful.
I want to say that I love the church. I really do. The United Methodist Church has meant a lot to me. And I came to the United Methodist Church in 1991. Because I critique the church does not mean I'm an anarchist. I believe some of the laws of the church ought to be changed. I believe, by and large, the United Methodist Church has a whole lot of beauty within it. And I stay within the church because I've seen lives change because of the ministry of the United Methodist Church. And I'm not willing to give that up. I've rooted myself in the United Methodist Church. Now, they may try to put me out. But I love the church, and I think for the church to survive and to be the flagship prophetic instrument that God has called it to be, requires persons like you and I to stay engaged with the church. And so I encourage that.
We thank you for your thoughtful, provocative questions, for your thoughtful, provocative responses. And as a preacher, I can't leave without offering a challenge for going forth. And that challenge for going forth has to start with my own confession. This is not on the notes that I had planned to use. But as I sat here, I saw the image as being that of a frozen heart. And the reference was made to John Wesley's heartwarming experience. Well, thank you. John Wesley's heartwarming experience didn't come easy for him. And the word I would like to speak is primarily to the white heterosexuals among us, including me, to name where we are even below the visible in terms of our imbibing the power, the inappropriate naming. It is for us to primarily, Jim, work on this process of that heartwarming, that ice melting, that will bring peace and justice. I have recently been reading a book by Parker Palmer, The Heart of Democracy. Some of you, it has been a bestseller recently. And Parker Palmer talks about the core, the heart of democracy, the heart of the church. And he gives the illustration of John Woolman, a Quaker in the 1700s, who became so convicted of his own racism, that he gave up his slaves. He tried to convince his Quaker meeting to give up their slaves. They didn't. But that Quaker meeting tended his farm and his business as John Woolman went up and down the East Coast from his home in New Jersey for 20 years, trying to convince fellow Quakers that they were wrong. He'd eat with them if the food wasn't prepared by the slaves. He wore clothing that was not dyed with colors that had to be produced by slaves. He lived it, he talked it, he engaged in civil discourse. He went back to his meeting in New Jersey, and eventually, through their discourse, built a consensus around giving up slavery. 80 years before that happened for the nation, through the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation that we honor today. There is still work to be done on racism, heterosexism. It's harder, I feel the sexism, but it's harder for me to speak to that. But I urge all of us here to see what heartwarming do we need. Who among us is going to be a John Warren? Thank you.